This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, War, Peace, and the Presidency. We are breaking with convention. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. We're broadcasting from the studios of CAN TV here in Chicago. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world. Vice President Kamala Harris formally accepted the Democratic presidential nomination Thursday night here in Chicago. Harris is the first black woman and person of South Asian descent to be nominated for the president by a major party. Her nomination came just over a month after President Biden dropped out of the race. Before a thunderous crowd at the United Center, Harris laid out her case against Donald Trump.
Fellow Americans, this election is not only the most important of our lives, it is one of the most important in the life of our nation. In many ways, Donald Trump is an unserious man. But the consequences of putting Donald Trump back in the White House are extremely serious. Consider not only the chaos and calamity when he was in office, but also the gravity of what has happened since he lost the last election. Donald Trump tried to throw away your votes. When he failed, he sent an armed mob to the United States Capitol, where they assaulted law enforcement officers. When politicians in his own party begged him to call off the mob and send help, he did the opposite. He fanned the flames. And now, for an entirely different set of crimes, he was found guilty of fraud by a jury of everyday Americans and separately found liable for committing sexual abuse. And consider what he intends to do if we give him power again. Consider his explicit intent to set free violent extremists who assaulted those law enforcement officers at the Capitol. His explicit intent to jail journalists, political opponents, and anyone he sees as the enemy. His explicit intent to deploy our active duty military against our own citizens. Consider the power he will have, especially after the United States Supreme Court just ruled that he would be immune from criminal prosecution. Just imagine Donald Trump with no guardrails, and how he would use the immense powers of the presidency of the United States, not to improve your life, not to strengthen our national security, but to serve the only client he has ever had, himself. And we know what a second Trump term would look like. It's all laid out in Project 2025, written by his closest advisors, and its sum total is to pull our country back to the past. But America, we are not going back. We are not going back. We are not going back. We are not going back to when Donald Trump tried to cut Social Security and Medicare. We are not going back to when he tried to get rid of the the Affordable Care Act, when insurance companies could deny people with pre-existing conditions. We are not going to let him eliminate the Department of Education that funds our public schools.
We are joined now by historian, author, and activist Barbara Ransby. She's a professor of Black Studies, Gender and Women's Studies, and History at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Ransby's latest book is Making All Black Lives Matter, Reimagining Freedom in the 21st Century. Welcome back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us, Professor Ransby. Well, it was a historic night in many ways. You have Vice President Harris accepting the presidential nomination before 20,000 people. Many of the women, though she wasn't, many of the women were dressed in white to honor the original suffragists. Can you talk about the significance of this moment and what Vice President Harris did and didn't say?
What she did and didn't say. Thanks for having me, Amy, and welcome to Chicago. I don't have to say welcome to Juan because he's here with us. But yeah, I mean, it's a historic moment in a lot of ways. Certainly, it breaks a barrier. You know, I never thought I would see a black woman nominated. But you know, I want to speak to the historic significance, but I also want to talk about the contradictions, right? That Kamala Harris, unlike others who have, you know, fought for inclusion in the Democratic Party at the convention, you know, isn't coming out of the same kind of movement. She has ties to the civil rights movement through her mother, and she also participated in the anti-apartheid movement. But really, you know, I think a lot of what I appreciate about this generation of activists is the de-emphasis on representation and the emphasis on politics and the emphasis on where do you stand on issues. And if we think about a tradition of black women in politics, including in the Democratic Party, right, it has been pushing the conscience of the Democratic Party toward a radical inclusivity, towards some of the most oppressed sectors of our community and all communities. And so, yes, it is significant in terms of representation, but again, at a time when representation is limited. We have a multiracial right-wing movement, by the way. So representation is not the goal. And, you know, I just want to de-emphasize in some ways. I mean, of course, we can talk about, you know, a larger political lineage, which she is connected to, but I know, you know, I think we're going to talk about Fannie Lou Hamer and others. But I think of someone like Abbas Allaway as much more in the tradition of Fannie Lou Hamer than a Kamala Harris. So, yes, it breaks barriers. Yes, you know, it is a historic moment in a certain sense, but we have to also talk about the gravity of this moment and the politics that Kamala Harris brings with her. So that is my historian's view and my activist view.
And your response to the DNC's decision to not allow a Palestinian American voice on the stage?
Disgraceful. Absolutely disgraceful. I mean, and it was such a small ask. You know, we're witnessing genocide in Gaza right now, and many of our hearts are breaking. Certainly our Palestinian friends and colleagues here who've lost dozens of family members, people you've had on your show who tell harrowing stories, the physicians who've gone there and seen the devastation of children, hospitals bombed, et cetera. So, you know, a minimum of decency would have been to allow for a Palestinian voice on that stage.
And I'm wondering, the whole week, for those of us who remember the old Democratic conventions, the first convention that I covered
yeah,
as a
you were
reporter
raising trouble in '68, I hear.
Right, but the first one I actually covered inside was in 1984.
Okay.
And what has struck me about this convention and the last several is the level of choreography of mass spectacle.
Yes.
There are no, back in the 60s, 70s, and even the 80s, individual delegates could hold up their own signs. You know, the cameras would show dissent in the audience. Now we're talking about a Democratic Party where every single banner is controlled and decided by the organizers of the convention, and everyone like sheep get up and hold the same signs at the appropriate times that they've been told to do it. And so you really have no no dissent
Right.
visible at all within a supposedly Democratic party.
Interestingly, on the floor, it was the Minnesota delegation, and that's an interesting delegation. They had 10 uncommitted people who would not commit to President Biden at the time when voting in the primary. And they held up the names of Palestinians who had died in Gaza. And immediately, the other delegates in the Minnesota delegation, well prepared, held up USA signs that covered all of those signs.
Yeah, I missed that.
And then you had the unfurling of the banner earlier in the week. This was in the Florida delegation by a Florida delegate, a Connecticut delegate, and a delegate from Michigan that said, "Stop arming Israel." And they immediately put up signs, placards that said, "We love Joe." It was Monday night when Joe Biden was speaking. And immediately some of the runners for that Florida delegation started handing out dozens of placards. And so they had more and more to cover the banner because that was particularly large.
Concealing and containing protest and this sort of cosmetic appearance of unity when there was dissent in that room, not just the uncommitted delegates, but others. But it has a carnivalesque feel to it. And the real conversations and the real passions and debates were happening outside.
Well, let's stay inside for a minute.
Okay.
Let's go to Kamala Harris addressing the issue of Israel-Palestine and Israel's war on Gaza.
With respect to the war in Gaza, President Biden and I are working around the clock, because now is the time to get a hostage deal and a ceasefire deal done. And let me be clear, I will always stand up for Israel's right to defend itself, and I will always ensure Israel has the ability to defend itself, because the people of Israel must never again face the horror that a terrorist organization called Hamas caused on October 7, including unspeakable sexual violence and the massacre of young people at a music festival. At the same time, what has happened in Gaza over the past 10 months is devastating. So many innocent lives lost. Desperate, hungry people fleeing for safety over and over again. The scale of suffering is heartbreaking. President Biden and I are working to end this war such that Israel is secure, the hostages are released, the suffering in Gaza ends, and the Palestinian people can realize their right to dignity, security, freedom, and self-determination. And know this, I will never hesitate to take whatever action is necessary to defend our forces and our interests against Iran and Iran-backed terrorists.
That's Vice President Kamala Harris in her acceptance speech for the Democratic nomination for president. Speaking here in Chicago at the United Center, Professor Ransby, your response.
Well, I was glad to hear her mention the suffering of the Palestinian people, but of course it didn't ring true. It rang a little bit hollow because the Biden administration could stop much of that suffering, by not sending 2,000-pound bombs and $3 billion a year to the Israeli government. So, it would have been backed up by action if it would have been backed up by allowing a Palestinian speaker to speak in their own terms. That part would have resonated. But of course, talking about Israel's right to defense is disguised as the fact that this is an offensive war. Offensive on every level that word means something, right? And the United States is facilitating it. And the 40,000 Palestinian lives. I mean, you all, absorb these numbers every day in your reports, but it is it was not enough. It was the wrong message. And, you know, a throwaway line about Palestinian suffering does not get it.